vostro studio professionale è stato fondato nel 1986 a Londra e da allora i vostri progetti riguardano gli ambiti della rigenerazione urbana, della progettazione dei parchi pubblici fino al restauro di giardini di particolare valore per la conservazione del paesaggio. Secondo la vostra esperienza, che cosa è cambiato durante questi 30 anni nella definizione di spazio pubblico?
Well, one of the biggest changes has been that we have a London mayor, and that has brought the whole focus on the public realm in a way that prior to having a mayoral office was not there. So there's been an enormous amount of focus on public realm as an important part of how livable London is. And part of that agenda that has been brought through that office has been to do with localism and to do with engagement of communities, so that projects evolve out of the conversation that one has with the communities who are directly affected by the projects. So I think that's probably one of the big changes.
Another significant change would be the fact that the state-sponsored lottery contributes a significant amount of money year on year to heritage projects, but also to projects that have a strong community base. And we've been working on a lot of projects recently which have looked at historic landscapes but tried to make them relevant to the users of today. And the majority of the funding for those sorts of projects comes from the Heritage Lottery. So even in the recession, people still buy lottery tickets, and that money is fed directly into public space and park improvements, which I think is a fairly unique situation, probably across the world in a way, that it still means that park improvements happen. The biggest challenge with that is that it focuses primarily on capital funding, so paying for the improvements, and it contributes a little bit to looking after the maintenance for 5 years, but really then it's up to the owners to start to put in place strategies for looking after it into the future.
I think probably one other thing is to do with the planning system and the fact that there is a statement of community involvement that's required as part of the planning system, and also there's a requirement for public realm to be part of the submission, which is to do with design and access. So the planning system has evolved in terms of the importance of public realm.
Recentemente si è parlato molto di voi in occasione di una competizione di progettazione internazionale, RIBA, attraverso il progetto Promenade of Curiosity in collaborazione con lo studio Erect Architecture per creare una nuova e sorprendente identità nel quartiere londinese di Vauxhall. In questa occasione avete parlato di progettare paesaggi resilienti per tutta l'area della Grande Londra. Che significato intendete dare a questa nuova entità di paesaggio?
Resilient landscapes has obviously many meanings, and I think probably one of the most important ones with regard to that project was to do with water management and sustainable urban drainage. So it was to do with understanding how best the landscape could be transformed from impermeable to permeable, thereby kind of bringing lots of opportunity for new tree planting, making beautiful cycleways, and increasing the opportunity for walking a neighbourhood which is at the moment very dominated by traffic.
Yeah, I mean, it's Vauxhall's like many parts of London. There is incredibly rich layers of history that only really need somebody with the skills to tell that story. And Vauxhall's quite unique in a way in that it's fairly centrally located, but had quite a lot of industrial heritage. And as Joe says, a lot of the streets were designed for heavy vehicles, not for people to move around. So it's going through a massive change. It's very heavily dominated by people who work there in terms of the population, but there's a change towards residential. So the spaces are going to have to work harder because more people will be using them. And our approach really was about telling a narrative or revealing a narrative about the area without making major changes and making the open spaces work a little bit harder for a variety of uses. And it's interesting in Vauxhall, Vauxhall was the home of the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens in the 16th to 18th century, and it was pretty much London's playground at that time. So there's a real history of using public space for entertainment. So we kind of revealed that through a strategy that was looking at using space for active uses and also celebrating the greenness of the area as well.
And using green infrastructure to express that.
And then another thing is that Vauxhall right on the River Thames, and quite a lot of London doesn't engage with the river as well as it could. So a lot of the projects that we proposed were about refacing public spaces so they were part of the river experience and not turning their back on them and looking back towards the city.
Nel 2011 avete vinto il premio President's Award del Landscape Institute di Londra e nel 2014 siete stati finalisti della Biennale Internazionale del Paesaggio di Barcellona con lo stesso progetto Making Space in Dalston per l'eccezionale dimensione pubblica del vostro progetto realizzato in collaborazione con UMAF. Il successo di questo progetto nasce dal coinvolgimento della comunità nelle fasi di costruzione del processo progettuale. Potete spiegarci attraverso quali modalità riuscite a creare questo incontro tra comunità e team progettuale e quale peso hanno i suggerimenti dei cittadini all'interno del progetto definitivo?
This project, Liza Fior from MUF and ourselves, we were actually on a completely different project, geographically close, but a separate project, and it came to mind that through that project, which was a big infrastructure proposition by the London Development Agency and the GLA, that one aspect of it had been completely overlooked, and that was that the project was moving ahead without public consensus. And there was so much anger in the area because there were really very significant cultural assets which were not listed buildings, they weren't things of merit in that respect, but culturally there were incredibly significant projects and buildings that were going to be sacrificed. And so Liza and I went to the GLA and we said, we feel that there's a project here that unless you commission it, which is to do with talking to the whole community, that's the business, the arts community, the craftsmen and all the community around that, the residential community, that if you don't engage, then there's going to be a nightmare here. There was already rioting in the council chambers because there was so much emotion. And we wrote a brief and we gave it to the Design for London, as they were then, and said, we suggest that we do a little piece of mapping and that we actually have an exhibition and we have a discussion in a local theatre with artists to see whether there's another project which could start to resolve this tremendous amount of opposition in the area to everything. And so we were allowed to do that, and it was very successful. And from that grew a discussion with a lot of different groups who had never got together, never been asked what they felt about regeneration of the area. And for the first time, I think they felt that their voice was being listened to. So we developed this project. We then had to tender on it, and luckily we got the project. And basically that grew out of those discussions. So in a sense, the project grew itself simply because we listened to the people who knew the place like the back of their hand, and then we framed up those projects in terms of the current political agendas and represented them back to our clients. And so, in a sense, they couldn't fail because everyone had been part of developing those briefs. So it was an extraordinary project in that respect. And now, we call that deliberative planning, which is kind of the constant feedback loop between discussion and proposition, rather than just saying, here's a design, do you like it or not? There's a lot more two-way discussion. And I think that was probably what made it feel very different.
Yeah, I think what's really key about a project like Making Space in Dalston is that the dialogue and the process were as important as the completed work. And there has been an issue where people have looked at that project and seen the success and thought we can do that in other parts of the city or in other countries, but they've not gone through that initial dialogue process. So the outcome would probably be very different if you engage with different people and you realise that rather than an artist community, you maybe had a community of industrialists who had a different set of skills and could contribute to that process in a different way. And I think it really is just to focus on process and dialogue to inform the design is absolutely critical. So that's very much a project in Dalston, born by Dalston.
And I think what happened out of that was that, and really our collaboration with MUF was evolving and was at the same time. We hadn't worked together before. There was a lot of discussion between us about how we should move forward. And actually, because we were all working hard together, it was easy for our steering group, our stakeholders, to get involved as well. And in the end, we invited them in on our side. So some of the people who had been very, very upset about what was happening to their neighbourhood were then invited to be on as part of the steering group. So they would then start to understand that planning can have a positive outcome.